Testing, testing. All right, this is Dr. Brown. I'm just getting off work. I wanted to talk about clinical decision making, risk assessments, especially in the context of involuntary holds. This is a area that was never really explicitly taught to me when I was a resident, and something that you just sort of picked up from the attendings, how they dealt with different situations, but there was a lot of variance. I see a lot of variance between how two different attendings might handle the same situation. One attending might discharge somebody who just had a suicide attempt after, one day, and you might have another attending who would, involuntarily commit them for a week. And there's just a lot of variance on how different psychiatrists might handle these kinds of situations. Um, so I wanted to give my 2 cents on this. I think no matter what, there's not going to be a right answer, and there's always going to be some inherent variance because we don't have all the information. There's a lot of uncertainty involved in psychiatry and medicine more broadly. This is not all too different from surgeons deciding whether or not to take on a, potentially risky surgical case. You might have some surgeons who are more risk tolerant and are willing to do it, and you might have others who are more conservative and are not willing to do it. And so the same type of thing happens in psychiatry, where you have some psychiatrists who are more risk tolerant and might be willing to, let someone go that might seem a little bit risky in terms of their potential for danger to self or others, or impairment due to psychosis, say. And you might have some psychiatrists that are very risk averse and are going to utilize all the legal channels to keep someone involuntarily, to sort of make sure that they're not, letting someone that's a potential danger loose. So there are decision frameworks. There's a whole, field of academic study on decision science. A lot of it is using Bayesian sort of reasoning, where you have a prior set of probabilities and then new data updates that into a posterior. So this is getting too abstract already. Let me give an example, okay? This is not any real case, but it is a sort of prototypical case that is challenging on the, let's say, inpatient psychiatry ward. Okay, so someone gets admitted involuntarily, let's say. Okay, so the police pick somebody up. They were doing something weird. They're brought to the hospital under involuntary hold, and the details of that, the specifics are going to vary, often significantly from state to state, in the legal process for that. But in general, most states have some process for involuntary holds and involuntary commitment, okay, where someone can be admitted to a psychiatric hospital against their will for some period of time, with some legal process at play. Usually a judge is going to have to sign off on it at some point. There's going to be a hearing, so on and so forth. Okay, I'm not going to get into the details of that because that varies. But so someone shows up on your unit. They're involuntary. They were, let's just say the police report says that they were yelling at people in the park, or something like that. Okay, and just weren't making a whole lot of sense. They arrive on your unit. They're, you can tell something's off about them. They're acting a little bit strange. Sometimes they maybe make strange gestures or strange facial expressions or say odd things, but they're still able to have a conversation with you. They're still, for the most part, relatively logical, able to manipulate information. They aren't really, they don't seem to have good insight as to why they ended up in the hospital. If you ask them, hey, why do you think the cops brought you to the psych hospital? They're like, I don't know. You try to talk to them. Oh, sounds like you were doing something a little bit strange. And they're like, no, And, you ask them if they're uh, having suicidal thoughts or homicidal thoughts. They say no. You ask them if they're hearing voices or seeing things. You go through your usual sort of review, psychiatric review systems, and they're denying everything. But again, there's something definitely off about them, right? Like, your clinical experience suggests strongly that they're in a state of psychosis. It's just not super overt like it is in other cases. The cases where it's really easy, the decisions are really easy. Someone lands on your unit, they've got paperwork saying that they were telling their mother that they were Jesus and aliens were reading their brainwaves, and then they show up on the unit, and they're telling you about how the aliens are putting thoughts into their head, and just making no sense at all, right? Those cases are easy. Like, yes, they're in a state of acute psychosis. They're not safe to leave the hospital because they're not in touch with reality. They're likely to make um, they're likely to at least accidentally injure themselves or other people because they're having these, paranoid delusions, for example, right? That's easy to justify. It's these cases where it's a subtle psychosis or it's a more subtle mania, or the patient is, you know, got paranoid delusions, but they're just online enough to sort of know that they need to hide it from you, right? Those cases are challenging. Oftentimes I can kind of resolve those cases just by spending more time with them. Someone can look really good for the first 10 or 15 minutes of a conversation, but you sit with them for 30 or 40 minutes and then they start to reveal the psychosis. And then the decision becomes easier again. Um, but sometimes even so, there's just something off. You can tell that there's a number of small cues showing that they're in psychosis, but again, what do you have to hold them on? They're not saying they're going to hurt anybody. Maybe they haven't hurt anybody yet. Um, maybe they were doing something a little bit dangerous, like maybe they were caught by police driving erratically. Okay, that'll make it a little bit more interesting rather than just yelling at somebody in the park. Okay, they were caught by police. They were driving erratically. They were kind of behaving weird. So the police thought something was off. They brought them in. Okay. Um, Now another easy case would be if they're just like, yeah, I'll stay. I'll stay in the hospital and I'll take your medicines. But how often does that happen, right? They don't think anything's wrong with them. They don't have any insight that they have a mental health condition. They want to go. They think this is, just terrible that they're in the hospital. Um, so, so what are you going to do? What are your options, right? So that's the first step of the decision-making process, is to really generate a thorough set of reasonable options that you could take. Okay. So, okay, I should back up. The first step is to obviously do a good psychiatric interview and really try to get as much information as you can to build a case as to what is going on, right? Um, and getting collateral information is super important in these cases. So, there's so many times where someone lands on the unit and they present well at first. Again, that first 20 minutes, they're looking pretty good. Maybe something feels a little bit off, but you can't really, you don't feel like you have enough to keep them there involuntarily. And then you get on the phone with their mother or their brother or someone who knows them well and obviously has their best interest at heart. And they'll tell you, oh yeah, the patient was telling me all sorts of bizarre things, and um, you know, they were like taking toilet water out and drinking it because they thought it was holy water, something really strange like that. And then you're like, okay, all right, I'm not, there really is something going on here. So collateral information is super important in psychiatry, especially, the inpatient unit, when people are there under, you know, unclear circumstances. They land on your unit for unclear circumstances, or they're really the patient's really hiding what's going on from you, or just because they don't have any insight that they're having a mental crisis, right? Collateral information is super important. You don't always have the luxury of that. Sometimes there's nobody to contact, and that makes it harder. But okay, but that's step one: doing a good psychiatric assessment, getting collateral information, basically gathering all the facts and data that you can to make an assessment of what's going on. Okay, so let's make let's say that you have decided that this patient, it was brought to the unit by police because they were kind of driving erratically. They weren't saying anything suicidal or homicidal. They were driving erratically and just kind of being bizarre. They were brought to your unit on an involuntary hold. So step one is you have to decide, is this hold warranted, or is this, where the police just totally off base and this person needs to be discharged immediately, right? I would wager that the vast majority of psychiatrists, under most situations, if someone is brought to the unit on an involuntary hold by, police or EMS or whatever it may be, that they're not going to just let them go that same day. And some of that may be, you don't have enough information yet. You at least need more time to get a hold of people or review the documentation or whatever. But this gets to the kind of first decision tool, is that there's asymmetric risk, right? And I think this is a very important way to make decisions under uncertainty, is look for the asymmetry. So, if someone shows up on your unit voluntarily and the situation is unclear, all you have is just, they were doing something a little bizarre, but they're seeming to be fine here on the unit, you have two options, right? Let them go or keep them for further evaluation. If you let them go, what is the risk of that, right? What's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? If you let them go, the best case scenario is this was all just a mix-up. The police were just off base, or EMS was off base, or whatever, and they'll go on their merry way and nothing bad happens, right? The worst case scenario is that this was just the tip of the iceberg, right? Whatever the police saw, the sort of subtle, bizarre behavior or whatever you're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg of a florid psychosis that puts them at serious risk of injury to self or others, or grave disability. And if you let them go, they're going to rapidly decompensate and get themselves or somebody else hurt, right? And that's going to be on you. On the other hand, if you keep them, for a few days or whatever it may be, what's the best case scenario, right? Best case scenario is they agree to treatment, they get better, you send them out with some medications and some follow-up appointments, and you get them back home or get them into some sort of residential program or whatever kind of discharge placement option seems best, and totally change the trajectory of their life at that point. You get whatever psychosis state under control. Okay, that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is they pretty much are the same. They don't want treatment. They don't think anything's wrong with them. And you let them go after a few days, right? So the worst case scenario, let's just focus on worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, if you let them go the same day, is something really bad happens. They hurt themselves, they hurt somebody else, etc. Worst case scenario, if you keep them for continued observation and evaluation, even if they are refusing treatment, worst case scenario is they just, we put them out a few days, right? We waste a few days of their life in the uncomfortable setting of a psychiatric hospital. So there's a clear asymmetry, right? On the one hand, something really bad could happen. On the other hand, they're just upset with you because they had to be in the hospital for a few days. So that's why that's that asymmetric risk, right? That drives most of our decision making around this. And that's why most psychiatrists are not going to just let somebody go on the same day in that kind of a situation. Okay. And that's a really useful heuristic to think about it. And that best, I'll call it the best worst case analysis, and looking for those big asymmetries. And then, so complicated than that sometimes. And, and again, some of this will depend on your specific state, because some states have much higher standards as to when someone can be involuntarily held. In which case, obviously you just got to follow the rules. Another case where the psychiatrist has a lot more discretion as to whether someone should be held involuntarily or not. But there are some cases, like I'll give you an actual case, and again, I'm going to obfuscate some of the details to abide by HIPAA. But I had a case a while ago of a woman who came on the unit involuntarily, and she was definitely in a state of psychosis, but she wasn't like gravely disabled. She was, able to take care of her basic needs. She was found, I think, just kind of wandering in traffic or something like that. Not even that. It was something less obvious than that. But she was doing something weird, and the family got involved and got her admitted involuntarily. And she has no insight. She shows up there, she's like, I don't know why I'm here. My family, they're so mean. There's nothing wrong with me. I just want to go back to my life. I don't want to be here. You can't hold me here. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna participate. You gotta let me go. All that stuff, right? You talk to the family. There's definitely some signs of psychosis that they've picked up, but nothing like super severe, right? They're not like trying to hurt people because they're having paranoid delusions and things like that. And you can clearly pick up that they have some psychosis, but they're still fairly put together. They're able to have a conversation with you. So what do you do in that situation, right? And let's say that this patient is like, listen, if you let me, and this happened with this patient. The patient was basically like, I will take your medications. And, I basically said, hey, I understand you don't think there's anything wrong, but, I believe that you're in a state of psychosis, and that's why you were here. And, this is what psychosis means. And, they didn't like that, but, I was like, I recommend that you take, this antipsychotic medication, and explained it. And, they were not, still not getting it, right? They just don't have insight. But they were like, I will agree to take your medicine if you let me go. Like, I promise I will take this medicine. I know my family would want me to take it, and I know, like, they keep saying that there's something wrong with me, and they keep trying to get me into this hospital. So if you're telling me that this medicine will keep me out of the hospital, so I will take it if you let me go. So what do you do in that situation, right? They're saying, like, if you keep me here involuntarily, I'm not going to take your medicine. I'm just going to sit it out. What do you do in that situation? So you could use the best worst case analysis, right? So if you let them go, after they've taken a few doses of the medicine, and they're tolerating it, at least, you may not see a response yet. The worst case is that they stop taking the medicine and something bad happens, right? The best case is that they really are telling you the truth. They don't really have great insight, but they have enough insight to sort of recognize that, well, maybe, I should do this just to stay out of the hospital or whatever, that I'm going to listen to the doctor. And so you discharge them, they take the medicine, they get their follow-up, and they, start to get better. That's the best case. Or, on the other hand, you could decide to just keep them involuntarily, hoping that something will change. And as they said, you keep them involuntarily, they stop taking the medicine, or they don't take it at all, they refuse, they're not cooperating. And then you're faced with the choice, well, do I file a court petition for court-ordered medications? They're really not being aggressive, they're not trying to hurt anybody, or they're not making threats to themselves. Is this really, the right thing? Maybe this is their, first or second psychiatric hospitalization ever. So, the worst case scenario is basically they're just in the hospital, nothing's happening, they're not participating in treatment. You don't really have a good case for involuntary treatment yet. The best case in that situation is they decide to change their mind, even though you keep them involuntarily. They take the medication, and then they get better, and then you are able to discharge them as you would like, right? So those are kind of the scenarios. In that particular situation, I decided to take a little bit of a risk, and I said this is her first psychiatric hospitalization. Yes, she's in psychosis, but she hasn't been hostile to anybody or tried to hurt herself or anything like that. So there's still a chance that something like that can happen, because when someone's in psychosis, maybe it gets a whole lot worse, or, because they're not fully attached to reality, they could end up inadvertently hurting themselves, right? So that's a risk, but it's their first psychiatric hospitalization. You want to maintain some rapport with the patient, because that goes a long way. And, so I'm going to say, hey, let's kind of meet in the middle. If you agree to, stay here for 2 or 3 days and take the medicine and just make sure that we know you're tolerating it well, then we'll let you go. Okay. And agree to follow up with outpatient care. So that's what I did, in that situation, because I felt like I didn't have a strong enough case yet to do something like involuntary medications. And I wanted to maintain some rapport and trust in the mental health system. And so that's what I did. Because, usually if someone is really, really sick, they're going to end up coming back to the hospital. And, you can't control everything. You have to balance all these factors. In that case, from a best worst case analysis perspective, the worst case of letting them go with some medications wasn't all that worse than the worst case of letting them stay. In both cases, you're basically at the same point where they're not taking their medicines, whether they're, in the hospital or not. And at some point, you still gotta, decide when to let them go. So, there wasn't a huge asymmetry there. So I decided to sort of figure out a middle path. So basically, when you're faced with a clinical decision, right, you need to come up with all the potential plausible options that you have available. And then for each option, you would need to know all the potential outcomes. But obviously that's too complicated. That's too hard, especially when you're running a busy clinical service. So the simpler thing is to still list out your plausible options, but for each plausible option, you're going to just consider what is the best case scenario, what is the worst case scenario. And I'm not talking about the, absolute best case, the absolute worst case. I'm sure in every case, the, worst case is somebody, they just die, right? You could make that the absolute worst case for any situation. But I'm talking about the most plausible worst case scenario and the most plausible best case scenario. And use that, try to find asymmetries between your options. If you have a clear case where the worst case scenario is much worse than the worst case scenario of option B, then option B may be the right choice. So this was mostly about clinical decision making, where you have a decision to make. I guess what I'd say clinical reasoning could be another thing if you're making that as the assessment portion, more of a diagnosis, figuring out what the problem is. And then decision making is now that you know what the problem is, or at least you have a plausible set of potential problems, you have a differential diagnosis at least, then what is your decision point? What are you going to do at that point? So I'll leave it there. I guess I'll need to do another episode on actual diagnosis because I've got more to say about that as well. So, all right, I will leave it there. I know this is kind of rambly, but hopefully that was helpful.